myself and Marella Patali, we are doing a podcast on mindful agility. But we are also studying mindfulness and its relationship to agility. From my perspective as an agilist, I wanted to improve the success results of agile implementations or agile transformations. And mindfulness activities seem highly related to that. And so I wanted to study that. Marilla, how come you're studying this?
So we started this together and it's called mindful agility because both practices can complement each other and can be used together to help us deal with different situations in life. And in this case, how to deal with failure, learn from failure, and use what we learn to get better and succeed.
Isn't it fair to say that this is a classic, the two together are better than the sum of their parts of
I think so.
practice? Yeah.
One of the characteristics of agility are experimentation to achieve success earlier at lower cost. And then the mindfulness is dealing with our ability to observe our surroundings and also be comfortable with good and bad outcomes. And so failure is an obvious place to start a conversation about mindful agility because when you're experimenting, failure is a necessary component. If you don't want to learn and you just want to be agile, you can have unlearning agile and then you never fail, so you never feel bad, so you don't need mindfulness. But that's
Well, yeah,
probably all.
this goes back to the quote we all hate, which is failure is not an option. Yeah.
Right.
It better be an option or you won't learn a damn thing. And that's really funny. I worked for the company that had that tagline.
Ron Johnson.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Okay, so what is failure? I think that's a key question for us because the way we define that will determine our relationship with it. So, most of us think of failures in a personal way, and I am certainly guilty of that on many occasions when I've had company failures or when I've had even interpersonal failures. I have taken that personally. My ego itself is somewhat injured, right? So this can occur to all of us: divorce, the loss of someone to death, or just a career. I might call it a hiccup now that I'm 63 years old, but I get fired, right? Like when I have been fired previously, that has been a significant ego injury. And it affects us in dramatic ways, and we'll talk about that coming up. We can have a reputation failure that we might not consider it a personal failure, but your reputation is damaged. And so what happens then is that you have fewer people that are on your side, fewer people that are going to help you succeed longer term. Investment failures, you lost some cash, say investing in the stock market or purchasing a property, or you just invest time in studying for a career that ultimately you decide is a waste. That can be an expensive failure, but you may not take it personally. A health failure is something we don't have a whole lot of control over. We have some control over it in advance, but once it happens, then we have to figure out what to do with that. Your healthy lifespan is reduced. And the last is the perspective that I like to take and can't always take it, to be honest with you. But I like to think of failures, I like to think of them in terms of experiments. So if I feel a personal failure, like I got a divorce at one time and felt really miserable, I could think of that as an experiment, a very long running experiment. And it was fun while it lasted. And so interpreting those things as experiments can help us by putting them in perspective as we go forward. So, our agenda today is we're going to talk about how to interpret failure and especially frequent failure, because Agile practices advocate high rate experimentation. And as a result, failures occur frequently. We'll talk about what the optimum failure rate is, and it's not zero. In other words, it's not every experiment you run is a success. Likewise, it's also not every experiment you run is a failure. We'll talk about how you can befriend failure and increase your learning from failure. So, our goal today is to help you learn faster and succeed better. So, first, I want to talk about failure and its relationship to success. You don't have to work very hard to discover successful people and the stories of their failures prior to their success. And most of those stories are dramatic. Walt Disney fired from the Kansas City Star, which is a newspaper, because he lacked imagination and had no good ideas, which is knowing Walt Disney, the first CEO of the Disney Corporation, which is now a gigantic organization, having someone say that, that would be a failure, but he didn't take that personally in terms of stopping him from doing further work. He did create an animation company, and then he established some contracts and so forth. But the way he constructed his contracts was flawed. He couldn't get paid for 6 months after doing a job. And as a result, the company was so close to bankruptcy, he dissolved it before it hit bankruptcy and created another company. Stephen King famously trashed his novel Carrie after submitting it to publishers and getting 30 rejections. He threw it in the trash. His wife retrieved it secretly and kept it for several weeks, and then came back to him and said, "Stephen, this is a really good novel, and I know that you've been rejected 30 times, but I want you to continue to pursue it because it's really great." And he did, and it is a best-selling novel and had, I think, more than one movie adaptation of this novel has been produced, so and he's a famous author now. Oprah Winfrey, born in poverty, fired from her first job because she was unfit for television. So all of these things tell us that these abject failures, things that might sideline most of us. I've certainly been in situations like this, and it took a year at least out of my life where I was like so anxious, humiliated that I didn't really pursue anything more for a while. So when we look at this, we say, okay, a failed experiment is not a failed experimenter. A failed experiment can lead the experimenter to success. So these folks learned from their failures, all of them. And you'll see more if you do any kind of search on the web. So I want to demonstrate to you how failure helps you learn faster and make a claim that seeking experiments likely to fail 50% of the time will help you gain information faster. So there's some caveats to that, which I'll discuss in a later slide, and Morella will as well. But first, we're just going to assume that the cost of an experiment is not very much. And so I can say, let's imagine someone giving you something you can experiment on. And that person says, I'm thinking of a letter in the alphabet between A and Z, and you're allowed to ask yes or no questions. So yes or no questions are very, very much like experiments. You're going to ask a question, and the experiment result is going to either succeed or fail. So if the person says yes, that's a success. And if the person says no, it's a failure. So the super fast way to do this is to say, is it in the first half of the letters? Is it between A and M? And the person can say, let's say the selected letter is D, the person would say, yes, that was a successful experiment. And so now you've narrowed down the information to a smaller portion of the possible results. Now that it's between A and M, you can say, is it in the second quarter? So is it between G and M? The second quarter is between G and M. And if you look, there's actually 7 letters there. There's 6 letters in the one I didn't ask about. So there's a 54% chance that whatever letter picked is going to be in the second quarter. It turns out, though, the one selected is in the first quarter. So that person answers no. That's a failure. There was a 54% chance of success, but it failed. But we learned something even more. So now is it in the first eighth? So that would be, is it between A and C? And the answer is no, no. So now we know it's between D and F, and we have to pick something. We either pick, is it D or is it between E and F? And so we decide to ask the question, is it D? There's a 34% chance that it is, but the answer is yes. So in 4 questions, we have narrowed down our result rapidly to what we're looking for. So imagine what other people do without using this technique. They might say, is it S? And the answer is no. So on average, if you ask questions about a specific result, it's going to take you 13 questions to get to the actual result on average. But in the worst case, you might ask 26 questions before someone gives you the right answer. So thinking about the experiments we run and targeting that 50% likelihood of success is very useful. Does that make sense?
I always heard that's how when they had the telegraph lines across the country and they weren't working. That was the easiest way to test them. The test first was the breakdown in the first half or the second half of the.
It sounds like trying to set artillery on a spot.
Mm.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting. So you shoot and then you go like, oh, it landed above the thing.
Correct.
And then you say, okay, well, I'm going to lower.
Then you shoot, it'll land below, and then you shoot in the middle.
Okay. So what's interesting in science, there's a couple of theories that relate to each of you. So for Rob, you said shooting, and you talked about the successive approximation to get to an accurate targeting. Mathematically, that is something called Newton's method. Newton's method is to do exactly that. You like try to get close and then you try to go the other direction. But now you've gained some understanding about how much varying your angle of your gun is going to affect the outcome some distance away. So that Newton's method is used for that. And for Matt, so there's a guy named
Yeah.
Claude Shannon, who was one of the founders of what's called information theory. And he developed communication strategies. So it's very related to telegraphy. So some failures are costly, and that changes things for us. Should we seek a 50% failure rate if the cost of failure is high? And the answer is, it depends on how high it is, right? So I love when we were just starting this conversation, Matt mentioned a friend who had a pickup line that he would use in bars apparently or online and would say, if at first you don't succeed, don't try skydiving. Failure in skydiving is costly. That is an interesting thing to think about. So if at first you don't succeed on a regular basis, not trying skydiving right off the bat is probably a good approach. You might try smaller things like taking a skydiving class, which I have actually done, and then they teach you how to roll, they teach you when to pull the cord, other stuff like that. And skydiving classes, the very first time they take you, you jump out of this plane and the chute is opened automatically. So
Mm.
basically, you jump out of the plane and there's a cord that pulls the parachute for you after you get a reasonable distance from the plane. So for those of us who want to plummet and then open the parachute just before you hit the ground, you have to wait, right, until you actually get certified that you can do that. So each of those is experiments, right? If
Yeah.
we go to a skydiving class, we're first experimenting with how to do rolls. So we're jumping off a little platform and trying to do a roll on the ground so that we're comfortable. And then we're learning how to pack a chute and what the structure of the chute is and how to pull cords and all that stuff. Each of those is experiments. We may discover failure in those experiments. We may freak out. In fact, I think I have been in situations. I think when I did skydiving, one of the people in the plane who was going to jump out with us decided not to go, and that was
Mm.
totally okay, and that was essentially an experimental failure. Their anxieties were so high that they couldn't do it, but they had learned a lot along the way, and they didn't get into Dwayne's problem, plummeting out and having PTSD or something. Many people think in order to succeed, they need to bet the farm, particularly people who aren't successful. Actually, I won't generalize that, but I will say I've met plenty of people who think success is all about betting big. And a lot of those people are not successful. So I just wanted to introduce that issue. Bankruptcy is a costly outcome. It's not the end of the world. Bankruptcy is there in order to transform what could be a complete disaster into a costly experiment. So legally, a bankruptcy allows you to tell creditors you're not going to pay them back. The idea behind that is you made this massive life mistake. All your capital is gone. We want you to learn from that mistake. The only way to let you learn from that mistake is to basically spread the cost among your creditors. They lent money to you, they're not going to get it back. The reason we do that is society wants you to experiment. So if an outcome is costly, choose a less costly experiment or reduce the risk of failure. Those are your two options. But if you want to learn fast, if you don't want to sacrifice that rapid learning, you need to choose a less costly experiment. That's the bottom line. So if you want to learn fast, go for the less costly experiment. Any questions about that or thoughts?
No, I like the attention to the all or nothing mentality because I think it's all too common.
Yeah. Yeah. Dan Dixon, who just was talking, and I recently did a study about Ron Johnson. In our podcast, we talked about how he was an all or nothing type of guy. He unfortunately hadn't had any major failures in his life. I think that's one of the things that's sort of characteristic of that all or nothing thing. Didn't have any failures in his life and had a couple huge successes, and then got to the point where he felt he could do no wrong, and then did a succession of billion-dollar failures. So, interesting. Okay, so these are the types of conversations we like to have.
Yeah. All right. So it sounds really good, right? And society kind of tells us that it's okay. You can learn from failure, it's fine. But the truth is that learning from failure is really difficult. Emotions, first, are the ones that undermine our learning because when we fail at something, our ego is threatened. Our sense of self, our sense of worth, our sense of success, how we view ourselves, and then how the world views us. That will impair our ability to learn from our failures. From a cognitive point of view, we struggle when we fail because the information that comes out of failure is not as obvious as it is when we succeed. So it is harder to extract. We have to go back and really investigate the failure, whereas successes are a little bit more obvious. Oh, this is why things worked.
I'm not sure I understand that. And I'm wondering if maybe an example might help here.
For which one, the both of them or the
No,
cognitive?
in other words, that it's easier to learn from success than from failure.
It is easier to learn from a success because we know that, let's say, if you have a project and you succeeded, then you know that you did 1, 2, 3, 5 things to succeed. This worked. I don't know, your finances were fine, and everybody did what they were supposed to do. When then you go back to investigate a failure, you have to dig a little bit deeper because first you have that emotion part of it that clouds your judgment. And second, the causes of why things fail might not be as obvious. You might have to do a 5 whys analysis. It might be more than one cause that something failed. So that's why it is more difficult to extract the information, the learning part of failure.
This makes me a little bit of like survivor bias, though, that when you
Mhm.
succeed, often don't investigate why you succeeded either.
That's my
And you
point.
might, yeah, you might even not know why you succeeded. I never thought of that.
One of the things that, and I don't want to belabor the point, but Dan Greeny, you and I both know John Fisher.
Yeah.
And one of his major bylaws is that luck is a significant part of success.
Yeah.
And I think Marilla, the point that the ego tends to cloud your ability to analyze a failure, I think that's spot on. But from an analytical standpoint, I would submit that you could do 5 whys against success just as easily as you could against failure.
So one of the things that I was going to bring in was we are actively researching these areas, and there are university courses on failure and other stuff like that. I'm working with a professor at Indiana University on this topic and others as well. So one thing we might do is we might read this reference to understand more clearly what was studied. And so if you're interested in that sort of research, I'm going to invite you to join us in future explorations, which we might do more frequently than our course-related experiments like this one. Okay, I'm gonna go on to the next
Yep.
slide.
Okay, so how can we befriend failure? How can we get comfortable with the idea of failure and kind of overcome and get used to those impediments those emotional and cognitive impediments? We can start by getting some distance, by cultivating some equanimity, impartiality, some objectivity, by observing from an outside perspective. The way we do this is by going into the third person. Language and perspective is very important. When we use language, why did I fail? Versus why did Mirella fail? When we move the position from the I statement to a third person statement, research has shown that helps us deal better with the emotional cargo, the emotional charge that comes with the feelings of failure. We become less reactive. We become, even in the long term, less vulnerable to ruminating or keep thinking, having those circular thoughts about why did I fail? Why did I do that? The way we can cultivate this third person perspective, this objective perspective, is by using the language in the third person. Why did Mirella fail? And telling the story in the third person, writing it down. We can write it down from the present point of view, but sometimes it's better to write it down from a future self point of view. What would future Mirella write to current Mirella, who right now feels miserable because she failed at something? And like I said, the benefits of this practice are that it's going to help us become less reactive, have a better, more objective and clear view of the situation, and thus help us learn better from the failure.
One of the Buddhist practice or, secular Buddhist practice is to remember frequently that the person that did those things even an hour ago is actually a different person than the person that we are right now because we're influenced by all the things around us. So that is one thing that Buddhist philosophy brings to the table is this ability to separate ourselves from what we did in the past. And that can be very beneficial in terms of doing this analysis.
Right. And also helps us understand that when we do that, when we do things from a future perspective or from a third person perspective, it helps us understand that with the causes and conditions at that time made it possible that failure happens. That with the information that we had and all factors considered, the causes, the conditions, the knowledge, everything, the experience, and luck or lack of luck all of those things contributed that failure happened in the past. We can't go back, we can't change that, but we can learn from that. And that's a very important perspective. The next thing we can do is recognize our successes. We all know that when we feel bad about ourselves, about something that we failed at, we did not do as well as we wanted or expected to do, then we get this tunnel vision and everything sucks. It is important that we recognize our successes because the more we cultivate this sense that things sometimes go well, sometimes don't, if we make that practice of recognizing our successes and cultivating those positive feelings about ourselves, they'll give us the confidence that in moments of difficulty when we fail, our minds and our bodies will remember, hey, you've succeeded before too, so you can do this. So it gives us a sense of confidence. And it was interesting that research found that's the reason why experts tolerate more failure. Experts in their field have had both successes and failures, and they can tolerate their failures because they have those stories of successes to give them the motivation and the confidence to keep experimenting, to keep trying, to keep looking for solutions.
Mm, interesting. So that also means that at least when they started, probably their experiments were much smaller scale, and they did achieve some successes in the small as they were progressing. At least that seems to be how these stories of experts like Walt Disney and all those folks went. It was their early activities involved some success.
Right, because you can make the point and say, what if you don't have any history? You just got out of school and your resume is empty, right? You have no experience. So in that case, we can use something different to help us.
The only question is that there, and again, I don't want to dwell on Ron Johnson, but this can be a two-edged sword where you've had multiple successes in your field and you have a failure, but you don't learn from it.
Right.
And
Very
by the
true.
way, this slide puts the previous slide in perspective because I was talking about the difference between analyzing success and failure, which
Mhm.
coming out is why it's so hard to analyze failure. And now everything ties.
I see, I see. Okay. Okay.
So the other thing we can do is observe other people's failures. So the slide that Dan had about Disney and Oprah Winfrey and Stephen King is a great example of that. When we observe other people's failures, we can learn more than we learn from when we observe our own failures, which bring us back to that analyzing. And it is easier because we are a little bit more removed from other people's failures. Let's say if I want to learn a new language, so it is better for me to go online and look up what not to do when I learn a language. What have other people done that didn't work? I don't know. They try to memorize 100 words a day or something like that. Instead of going online and looking how people succeeded, how some genius out there who has a perfect ear for languages learned a language in 20 days, that will not help me succeed. What will help me succeed is to go and look how people failed, how they had difficulties, And so I can know about that and I can take that into consideration when I make a plan of study of how I'm going to learn a new language. And that is important because human experience is universal. So we can draw from each other's experiences and from each other learning experiences, what other people learn.
One thing that I wanted to inject here is something that we see frequently. Someone becomes a raging success through whatever means. Oftentimes, when they write books, people want their heroes to be heroic. They want them to have achieved all these things through their inherent talents. And I think the reason that we want that is because we want to think of ourselves as not capable. Almost many of us want to think of these really great successes as achieving success through natural talent and then thinking of ourselves as not having natural talent. And therefore, we can be lazy and just watch TV all day because we're never going to achieve that, right? So those heroic books sell a lot. And I think what happens is the authors of those books don't necessarily talk about their failures.
Oh, the other thing
Wha-
is that when we want recipes, that's why the self-help industry is so prolific and so successful right now. So we want a list of to-dos. In order to achieve something, do 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're going to find happiness. We don't want to know how hard it was for those people because we don't want to work hard. We want an easy solution. So that's another way why we're
Yeah.
not interested naturally to learn from other people's failures.
And this
Yeah.
goes right down the line of what Matt was talking about in the failure episode. I think he used the football quarterback as the analogy, is that exception was the person's naturally talented, as opposed to thinking through all of the work and all the failures that person probably went through.
We'll
Yeah.
see. All right.
Okay, so the next one, feel the disappointment. This is my favorite and also the most difficult one in my experience, to let yourself feel the difficult feelings, the difficult emotions. Let the sadness and the regret be there. Sitting with our difficult emotions is very difficult, and that's where mindfulness practice helps us. That's where meditation helps us, which we're going to talk about it in a little bit. Sadness evolved as a response to failure and loss. And it encourages us to reflect on our experiences. And regret helps us to sharpen our motivation. Now, I want to point out here that while sadness improves memory and judgment, and those help us succeed in the future, I want to point out that sadness and regret are very different from anxiety, worry, depression, shame, and those negative feelings that we use to beat ourselves up for things. So sadness and grief and regret are feelings of loss that we can sit with, but they don't come with the lack of ability to move or ability to act that depression has, or the crippling effect that anxiety has on us and worry that don't let us do things in the future. You see that actually sadness and regret actually motivate us when we sit with them and we allow ourselves to feel those feelings. Then we can be motivated and we can cultivate those skills that will help us get up when that's done and start over again. So some things that we can do that's our practical things, and is first is a gratitude journal. This gratitude journal, it's a little bit specific, different from the other ones that are out there. The one that I'm grateful for, it was a sunny day, I don't know, stuff like that, or that I have love in my life, or this is about things that you did. This is a gratitude journal about things that you were proud of yourself, things that went well. And it helps us feel good about the little things. It helps us cultivate that memory of success that we recognize in our successes that we talked about earlier. And nothing is too small. At the end of the day, you can sit down and for a couple of minutes, for a few minutes, just write down, what did you do well today? And that will look differently for different people. But again, nothing is too small. I got up this morning. I brushed my teeth. I took a shower. I went for a walk. I chose a healthy snack instead of an unhealthy one. So every little thing that you did, you write it down. the more we do this practice regularly, the more we cultivate that sense, that confidence that we need to remind us when we fail that, hey, we have succeeded before. I can do this again. And then the mindfulness meditation practice is very important. Mindfulness is the ability to be present, to cultivate awareness of the surrounding, as well as what is going on in our minds. We can use mindfulness to focus on our long-term goal. And it is important to go back to revisit our long-term goal, our meaning, especially when we have a long-term project. It's important to every once in a while regularly go back and think, okay, is my goal still relevant? Is this still what I want? Am I going towards it? Am I moving in the right direction? Or do I need to change my goal? Or do I need to do something different? But it's important because when we look at that long-term goal, when we look at the meaning that it's there and what we want to achieve that's at the end of the road, it can motivate us when we fail and can help us start over again, reflect on the lessons we learned. Again, all of these practices hopefully will help us to be more clear, be more insightful, and be able to actually learn and reflect on those lessons that we learned from our failures. Self-compassion is very important because it's the one thing, the one skill that's going to help make those very difficult feelings that come with failure, make them bearable and make them so that we're still going to feel it. We're not immune ever from feeling those feelings. We're still going to feel the sadness. We're still going to feel regret. It's still going to suck when we fail. But when we practice self-compassion, we are able to bounce back much easier, much faster, and learn our lessons from the failures much better and come out of it more invigorated, more motivated, and ready to go and do another experiment, start over again, and keep going.
One thing I wanted to add to this, and I'm sure we mentioned it in half of our episodes, is that mindfulness meditation has a neurological effect that can improve our relationship with failure. It strengthens the neural connections in your frontal cortex, which makes it possible for you to overcome negative emotions that arise in a different section of your brain called the amygdala. And so you're able to make more thoughtful decisions. You're able to avoid those traps of anxiety and depression when you're considering failure. Any questions about that? Okay. Sharing is caring.
Yeah, this is so share your story. That's what we do, right? With the podcast. Sharing your own failure story fuels success down the line, as well as benefits others. Because when you share with other people, when you first you reprocess it, like just the process of that, of sharing, of talking about it, it helps you process your failure. And also you see the connectedness, you see the common humanity with other people. People relate to your failure and you can feel that connection. And that connection can help motivate you be more successful down the line. And of course, it benefits other people, the people you're sharing with. There was a study done with 7th graders that helped them when they shared their stories and went back and like how they did something. They showed that they did better after that. They did better in exams and had better grades because of sharing.
Like it would also promote the third person view of the failure.
Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting. We're actually issuing at least one failure episode, but probably multiple ones because we were talking amongst ourselves saying failure is something that when we talk about it, we learn from it. And it's a really good discussion point to relate to mindfulness and agility. Sharing our stories of failure with others leads us to really understand those things better. Our friends weigh in a bit and remind us of the things that we learned and the things that we could do now. All right. Any questions on that? Okay. Last slide here, and we have 5 minutes left. And that is just wanting to let you know that this is an active group, that we are very interested in failure and success. We're, of course, trying to figure out what helps us succeed in life and work. We're reading papers on this topic, failure, at the moment. And we're also reading work on agile practices, on neuroscience, and other things like that. So I did want to invite people listening to this, whether it's live or recorded, to reach out to us if you're interested in participating. We'll have a study paper and then we'll have conversations about it. And then we will be creating new agendas and new items of instruction around this. And then the other thing you can do is help us understand where we should continue to go. So if there's anything that this episode prompted you, you thought, oh, I want to know more about that, we would love to hear that. And I'll leave it open for people if you have some thoughts right now.
I think this is really good stuff.
Thanks.
It is. And
Thank you.
No, I'm thinking about, and again, I'm using the company that I just got involved with. It's going to be a perfect example for this. And I think this can really be fascinating.
Cool. Where should we go from here?
I mean, the thing that piqued me, and Dan thinks I was saying the same thing, was I don't think I ever analyzed why I succeeded. Actually, I'm not even sure if I ever think I succeeded. I usually just think, oh, I didn't fail. And I would try to decide what's the difference between succeeding and not failing.
Oh, there's a big difference. Yeah.
Yeah, because sometimes, that's interesting. Yeah, because it might seem like success is more obvious, but I think failure is more obvious sometimes, and you don't know why you succeeded, or even if you did. Yeah, so I'm kind of interested in the success side a bit, but analyzing. So
Yeah, as you're asking that question, I'm thinking that I feel like a success after I've had a string of failures in a particular field and then I achieve something.
No, that is very interesting. I think it's our part of our Western culture that we are very big on failure and we focus on it. We don't focus on success as much because we think that's going to make us more productive or more successful. So yeah, I like that. That's why I like the idea of the gratitude journal about changing our attitudes and changing our point of view and changing how we see ourselves and what we see as a failure or I didn't fail and what we see as an actual success.
this is a very mundane example, but Raul and I are trying to get rid of our furniture in our apartment, and it's been really stressing us because we can't get rid of it too soon because we need to sit on it, but we also need to get rid of it. And we did find someone who actually wants to buy almost all of it. And I don't know about you, Raul, but I'm almost like, oh my God, we got so lucky. But actually we didn't. Like, you told people we were just trying to get rid of stuff. We took pictures of it. We sent, like, we did stuff, but I still feel like, oh my God, we got so lucky. We're stuck with this furniture now.
Maybe you had lots of experiences in the past where you had too much stuff and you couldn't get rid of it. So now that was your string of failures and now you have a success.
The other thing
Yeah.
is you're ascribing success to luck as opposed to the efforts you made.
That's true too.
Right.
We'll never be, in many cases, we
Well, that's
won't
a
be able to
different-
tell,
that's a-
right?
Yeah, no, that is a complete different topic of conversation that speaks to how we see ourselves, our self-worth and self-confidence and value that we have, and how we attribute successes to outside sources like luck or other people or circumstances. And then we attribute blame to ourselves. If we fail, it's our fault. If we succeed, we just got lucky. So some of us have, I think many people have that, unless you're Ron Johnson, then you think you'll succeed every time.
Poor guy.
No, you know,
Yeah.
he failed because of bad luck.
He did.
Right, yes.
Okay, so thank you everyone for attending. We will be, I think this episode will be posted as a video. And so if you have any issues with that, please get with me.
It was great. It's my favorite one so far that you guys have done. It's really good.
This is really
Thank you.
useful.
Yeah,
Yep.
really.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, it's quite interesting.
Thank you.